Welcome to the Oral History Center. I'm Alexander Freund, as all of you know. I'm the director of the Oral History Center, and I would like to welcome you to tonight's Bonnycastle lecture with Professor Charles Hardy III. And I want to talk a little bit about the lecture series before. So the Bonnycastle lecture series was established in 1969, memory of Richard H.G. Bonnycastle by his wife and son. Mr. Bonnycastle was a publisher, former chair of the Winnipeg Metropolitan Council, and the University of Winnipeg's first chancellor. Bonnycastle lectures focus on an area of special interest to Mr. Bonnycastle, namely the economic, social, and cultural life of cities. So tonight we welcome Professor Charles Hardy. Dr. Hardy is a professor of history at Westchester University, just outside of Philadelphia. And he has been involved in a number of oral history and other historical projects. He has conducted hundreds of interviews since he began his work in oral history in the late 1970s, including over 100 interviews in the early 1980s with elderly Philadelphians, many of them migrants from the American South and from Europe, immigrants from Europe in the early 20th century. A pioneer in oral history and new media, Dr. Hardy is the producer of award-winning audio, video, and web-based documentaries, including the award-winning oral history-based radio series I Remember When, Times Gone But Not Forgotten, Going North, Tales of the Great Migration, and the award-winning essay in sound, I Can Almost See the Lights of Home, a field trip to Harlan County, Kentucky, co-authored with Alessandro Portelli. Dr. Hardy served as president of the Oral History Association in 2008-09 and as a member of the advisory board of Oral History in the Digital Age from 2009 to 2012. He has conducted oral history workshops for many organizations, including the Houston Asian American Archive at Rice University, the African American Museum in Philadelphia, the Oral History Association, and Philadelphia's Scribe Video Center. Together with colleagues over the past few years, Dr. Hardy has been creating a number of multimedia projects and walking tours documenting the Great Migration to Philadelphia in the early 20th century. Much of Charlie's work, including Going North, Stories from the First Great Migration to Philadelphia, is centered around students as active historians. Students contribute to projects through research, interviewing, website creation, digital indexing, and digital storytelling. For his work, Charlie received the Oral History Association's Non-Print Format Award in 2015 and the American Historical Association's very prestigious Roy Rosenzweig Prize for Innovation in Digital History in 2016.
That's what I keep telling my administration, very prestigious.
It is. If you want to know about digital history, that's where you start. This collaborative approach is also very much in line with the Oral History Center's motto of democratizing history, and that is why we invited Charlie to Winnipeg. Just like Charlie in his work and our workshops and projects, we try to break down the traditional barriers between teachers and students and between researchers and the research subjects, thus empowering everyone to actively participate in the making of history. So tonight, Charlie will talk to us about connecting classrooms and communities, student engagement through oral history and digital media. And this is a timely topic, and in Charlie we have an excellent guide to navigating this field. Charlie's current activities include an oral history project documenting the life and career of Congressman Kurt Weldon, and Philadelphia Immigration, an oral history-based website launched in July 2018 with OHMS indexes, biographical and historical sketches, digital storytelling projects in which students curated and worked with interviews conducted in the early 1980s. In spring 2019, students will build on this project, conducting and curating interviews in contemporary immigrant communities at branches of the Free Library of Philadelphia. So connecting classrooms and communities, student engagement through oral history and digital media is a timely subject because We live in a world that is inundated with new technologies and overwhelmed by seemingly new ways of teaching and learning. We are often without orientation using digital technologies, and we use them simply because they are available, not because they are the best answer to our challenges. The results can be ineffective or worse, damaging. At other times we don't use technology, or we use it poorly because our knowledge is superficial. Throwing smartphones and apps at a problem is never a good answer, but it is a path often taken. More than ever, therefore, we need deeply informed and creative ways of using technologies that leave us as teachers and learners in control instead of being controlled by technology. With his profound understanding of the historical development of different media, including radio documentaries, and with this experience in using digital media in oral history research and teaching, oral historians, community activists, and those in the digital humanities have been looking to Charlie's critical insights and creative guidance. And we are therefore delighted to have him as our speaker and guide tonight. So please welcome Dr. Charles Hardy.
Thank you. Okay, so a little history. Back in the late 1800s and early 1900s, Philadelphia proclaimed itself the world's greatest workshop. It was the first industrial metropolis in the United States, in part because of its proximity to more than 90% of all anthracite coal in the Western Hemisphere is located just north of Philadelphia in the anthracite region of Northeast Pennsylvania. And by the late 1800s, it has this incredibly diversified industrial economy and its population soars. Higher percentage of workers engaged in manufacturing than any other large metropolis in the city. So 1890 to 1950, the era of what in American history we call the new immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe. Philadelphia's population doubles in a period of 25 years. 1910 to 1940, the city receives close to 250,000 passengers through its Washington Avenue Immigration Station. It's no Ellis Island. It's a fraction of the numbers that came through Ellis Island, but it was a significant number of people. And by 1920, 20% of its close to 1.8 million members are foreign born. About 96,000 Russians, most of them Jewish, 65,000 Irish, 63,000 Italians, 53,000 Germans and Austrians, and another 53,000 other Eastern Europeans. By 1930, first and second generation Jews and Italians, you see the numbers there, we've got 380,000 of them. South Philadelphia is home to the nation's second largest Little Italy. North Philadelphia, before it's beaten by the south side of Chicago, is the second largest African American urban community outside of Harlem. There we go. So let's move forward then to the 1980s, 70s and 80s, a period of intense deindustrialization that accelerates after the Arab oil embargo in 1973. 1950 to 1982, manufacturing jobs absolutely collapse. The city's population drops, and in fact, we don't have population growth until 2006. So this is prolonged. It's nothing like Pittsburgh or some of the mill towns or in western Pennsylvania where they've literally they've gone to a quarter of their peak population. But it's very significant at the same time that you've got the old factories that are burning down. You've got abandoned urban neighborhoods. Philadelphia has 40 to 50,000 abandoned row houses. By the time I'm at WHYY, which is public broadcasting in Philadelphia in 1980. And by 2005, the city has one of the highest percentages of population below the poverty line of any large city in the country. So 1981, the director of WHYY, who was Bill Simmering, who was the founder of All Things Considered at National Public Radio, has moved to Philadelphia and has set up a sort of a mini All Things Considered at WHYY. And in 1981, he decides that, that the station should do a radio documentary series. And I'm the guy who's going to do it, because I'm the I'm the graduate student who's not going to finish his degree for another 8 years. And so here was our project objective. This was from the Pennsylvania Humanities Council grant application. To deepen an understanding and appreciation of the unique character and history of Philadelphia, to explore the profound changes in American society in a compelling and personal manner, to collect invaluable oral histories of broadcast quality, and to give access to people generally excluded from the media. So they're straight out of the NPR mission. Who did we interview? Before I came to HYY, I was the community coordinator for something called the Discovering Community History Project at the Urban Archives at Temple University. This is the first archive to actively collect the records of community organizations, of African American undertakers, of labor organizations. So it was part of the community and social history movement of the late 1970s and early 80s. And I work in the Urban Archives. There were these wonderful photographs of Philadelphians from the late 1890s to the early decades of the 20th century. And these were in the back of my mind, because these people, right, in their, who are just kids or teenagers or in their early 20s in the early decades of the 20th century, are now in their 80s and 90s. And they're there for us to interview. So here's what we produced. Temple was going to get the raw cassettes. Urban Archives was going to come to the repository for the interviews. I had 8 months worth of funding. And during that time, I recorded, I think, about 70 of them. But I had another 14 or so interviews recorded by 2 graduate students at Temple and a young African-American woman who worked at the Urban Archives. And from these, I produced 13 30 to 40-minute radio documentaries. You can see when they were broadcast on Fresh Air, so I was working with Terry Gross in Fresh Air at that time, and they gave me drive time, 4:30 to 5 p.m. That's the highest listenership hour for public radio. And the one program on You Work at Stetson's won a 1983 Corporation for Public Broadcasting Program Award. That was a lot of fun. The Stetson factory had long since abandoned, and I went there with a geography professor at Temple who was going to tell me about the history of the factory. And as we're standing outside of it, an old guy comes out and he says, "You all want to see the factory?" We go, "You get us?" He says, "Sure." His name was Frank Johnson. He was the night watchman for the factory. He'd grown up in its shadow, and he'd worked there his whole life. And now he was so he walked us through the hat fitting room, through the auditorium, up to the bell tower, the second largest bell outside of Independence Hall. And so I had all of that audio to and then did this series of interviews with former Stetson Hat Company employees to sort of have the soundscape and the ambience to sort of locate the interviews. So here were some of the programs. And you probably can't see these, but so Stetson was first. We had Life in the Neighborhood, an interview at a senior center with 4 elderly Italian-American women who were so great that I built the whole program just around their interview. This was from Southwest Philadelphia. Philadelphia, the most American of cities, was a line from a Chamber of Commerce promotional brochure from the 1920s. How are we going to make Philadelphia's economy even larger? Well, we're going to boast that we have fewer immigrants than other cities. So that was it. So it was a story of the immigration of Southern and Eastern Europeans. And then Philadelphia, the city of sweatshops. One of the fun things about the program, and this is coming out of the Discovering Community History Project, where my job was to facilitate rather than to go and to tell them what their history was, I wanted to do a program about the bad times. And in asking about the bad times without being leading, I thought they would tell me about the Great Depression. One response was, "What Great Depression? We were poor before, we were poor afterwards." So when we talked about the bad times and the bad guys, it wasn't the floor bosses in the factories or in the mills. It was old world fathers who wouldn't let you date outside your own ethnic group. So rather than do the program on the Great Depression and the horrors of sweatshops, I ended up doing a program on The Heart is an Involuntary Muscle. A program on romance and courtship in ethnic neighborhoods of pre-World War I Philadelphia, and the war that waged between strict old world fathers and their Americanizing children, which is still one of my favorite shows. Anna Van Dyke, who's, I forget what she was originally Czech, She eloped with a friend of her older brother just because she couldn't stand living with her father in particular. They went down to Elkton, Maryland, which was just across the border from Pennsylvania, and she thought that she'd married a bad man because that first night of their wedding he only rented one motel room. So she spent the whole night sitting in a rocking chair. They knew everything about death, very little about how one was born. So at the end of the series, on the board of directors of HYY was Mrs. Leon Sullivan, and Leon Sullivan was one of the most prominent African-American ministers in Philadelphia. In fact, he's the founder of the Philadelphia Plan, and there he is with Richard Nixon, which was coming out of the old Booker T. Washington self-development and self-help philosophy. What Sullivan did in the 1960s was he organized black churches' boycotts of businesses in North Philadelphia that did not employ African Americans. And then he went to major corporations like Coca-Cola and Chevy and Ford and says, look, you have a lot of black customers. And they go, yeah. He says, but you have no black showmen, or you have no black distributors. They go, that's right. Well, don't you think you'd sell more if you in fact integrated your workforces? They go, well, maybe that. So this became the Philadelphia Plan, and when Richard Nixon embraced actually affirmative action in hiring, they used the Philadelphia model, because Philadelphia, through Sullivan, had been able to convince corporations to bring about economic integration, which was the last, right? Martin Luther King was working on that when he was assassinated. So Mrs. Sullivan came to me and she said, Charlie, I really loved your series, but I was disappointed that there were so few African Americans in it. And I said, you're right, there were. I tried to get them, but being young and white, I thought I really shouldn't be interviewing African Americans. And the one African American interviewer I had really didn't deliver many. So that was the inspiration for my next project then. What I learned was that you had this great migration in American history, the largest internal migration of the 20th century, in which African Americans during the First and then the Second World War, when industrial employment opens up to them, transform themselves from a rural and a southern people to a northern and then a national and urban people. So it's this extraordinary migration, and it in fact began in, here you can see some of from the first Great Migration. Was begun by the Pennsylvania Railroad. Pennsylvania Railroad by 1916, just when the United States is coming out of the 1914 economic recession, has these insatiable labor needs. And once the First World War breaks out, there's no immigration from Europe. So they undertake a labor experiment in hiring African American Southern blacks. So they have a free transportation policy. And the railroad brings up 13,000 men and women before it discontinues it in 1917. And the reason why it discontinues it is the moment they get up to the northern rail camps, which are outside of cities, they're living in shanty towns. The food's crappy, it's outdoor work in all weather. They get their first paycheck, then they go into Philadelphia or New York, and they get a decent job, right? War wages, they can live in town. So they discontinued it, and I was fortunate to actually locate two African American men who'd come up on the free transportation, including William Fields, who was 94, I think, when I interviewed him, who came up from Dallas. So this was the needle in the haystack, these two men, with just these extraordinary life stories. So what I ended up doing is I was now, did this independently. I needed a nonprofit that would be able to take because the Pennsylvania Humanities Council and as other endowments does not provide grants to individuals. You have to go through a nonprofit. So it was the History Museum of Philadelphia that became the host organization for this radio series. And it was a very ambitious project. We were going to have curriculum in the schools. We were going to have traveling museum exhibits. We were going to do a collecting for their archive. The money never came through for all of that, but what we did get was the 5 radio documentaries and an educational supplement published by the Philadelphia Daily News. They produced 22,000 of these that they distributed to the high schools throughout, middle schools and high schools throughout Philadelphia. We had afternoon and evening broadcasts so that they were able to integrate them into curriculum. They had full transcripts of the 5 programs, a center section on how to conduct oral history interviews, brief biographies of all of the people whose interviews made it into the series in the back. And I was able to get Marshall Lorenzo Shepard Jr., who at the time was the president of the National Negro Progressive Baptist Congress, to narrate the program and to basically provide a black voice, narrator's voice for the series. After that, ancillary markets is what we called it. There was no internet back then, right? But there were Field to Factory exhibit at the National Museum of American History contracted me. This was the first time that the Smithsonian did a permanent exhibit on African American history. There was an exhibit in Philadelphia. There were some radio series, so I would occasionally get contacted. But the only way you could listen to any of the I Remember When or the Going North programs was from 1998, Jerry Zahavi at SUNY Albany, who was the founder and editor of the Journal of Multimedia History, had a website called Talking History, Oral History Productions, and he allowed me to be one of the contributing producers, and so archived a number of all of the Going North programs and a couple of the I Remember When ones. And then this was my archive. All of the Going North and I Remember When interviews sat in this IKEA cabinet in the basement of my house for 92, 30 years or more. The Philadelphia History Museum had copies of the cassettes from the Going North series, but I didn't trust them to be able to care for them. It was good I didn't, because the one time I went back to the museum, they were literally on top of a steam radio under a leaking ceiling, so the light was dripping down. And when we finally came to recently to build the Going North website, they couldn't even find them. So, and here was the metadata, which was good metadata in the 1980s. I had release forms, I had brief biographies, this was my hand indexes, and some segments that had been transcribed, right? This was very acceptable metadata. And so what happens then? So here we go then to the history of oral history and the existing principle that existing technologies shape oral history practice. So when you go back to the history of oral history, initially when the analog open-reel tape recorder comes over, it was German technology liberated by the Allies during the Second World War, transforms popular music and then classical music recording industry, and of course gives birth to the modern oral history movement with Nevins. I'll only speak from the American end of it, but at Columbia and then at Berkeley, they're using this new technology to basically fill in lacunae, holes in the historical record, because 20th century movers and shakers are not leaving the paper trail, the records, the journal entries, the rest that their predecessors did because of airplanes and telephones and other technology. Then in the 1960s, the audio cassette recorder comes along. Sony introduces that at the same time that we have the emergence of the new social history, history from the bottom up. And oral history then changes its identity from this tool for elite, the gathering of the reminiscence of the elite, to an essential tool in giving voice to African Americans, to immigrants, to union or workers, to people who simply haven't left the paper trails that historians are going to need to trace their histories. And of course, by the time you get to the 1990s and 2000s, we've got this whole new technology. So here's the world that I started in back in the late 1970s and early 1980s. Recorded with a Marantz or a Sony cassette recorder. Once I got to HYY, I always used an external mic because that was part of broadcast quality. Most oral historians were not using external microphones in the 1980s. Of course, then the only archival preservation media was open reel tape, not cassette. So if it was an archival project, you would either re-record over the open reels because they were expensive, or you'd bulk them because that was not the document of record. The transcript, the edited transcript, was your historical document. And of course, all of this was simply to use a typewriter to be able to publish your book. If you wanted to use photographs, you had to have a good lens, and if you're going to do any copying of the photographs, the historical photographs in people's collections, you needed a copy stand with special tungsten light bulbs, and then to get a photograph that you could reproduce in an article or book, you had to take it to a professional developer, unless you had a good darkroom in your basement. So it's very expensive, very labor intensive. Consequently, I was not taking photographs back in the early 1980s, to my eternal regret now. So then we move forward to the 2000s, yes? And it's a completely different media environment. Nowadays, on your cell phone, you can record interviews that are much higher quality than those even with a good external microphone on a cassette recorder in the 1980s. You can immediately download them to your laptop, which has infinite storage. Audio takes no space whatsoever. And then with Audible or Hindenburg or GarageBand, you can produce very sophisticated multi-track stereo documentaries. And then you can distribute them instantaneously on YouTube or on a website or any sorts of other platforms. So this is a technological revolution, and it's transforming oral history practice. And so the issue is, because oral historians are based in academia, we're sort of slow, particularly historians as opposed to other disciplines, to sort of grab onto this stuff and figure out what to do with it. So what I've been doing periodically, because I give workshops, is figuring, okay, so this proliferation, every couple of years I go in and I just do a Google search. This is from a couple of years ago. Oral history, 2,990,000 hits. So last night I went in, 380 million. This is absolutely explosive. The same thing, I got rid of my old YouTube, but for YouTube, 17 million entries for oral history. This is an absolute explosion. But it goes to the old right, garbage in, garbage out. So how do we actually produce something that's going to be worthwhile? So 2009, Dean Rayberger, who's an old friend, we worked together on a Pennsylvania history website, came up with the idea through the Center for Humane Arts, Letters, and Social Sciences at Michigan State University that we needed to get together all the major players in the field to come up with best practices for oral history in the digital age. So came through the Oral History Association, set up these 6 working groups, and for Matrix, they were focused on this one. They said what we really need to do, the future of oral history is going to be video capture. It's not come as quickly as they thought it would. But it was really good to bring together people with expertise in all of these fields, not just from the oral history community, but from American Folklife Center, from the Smithsonian Center for Folklife and Culture, American Folklore Society, Michigan State. And so we had these series of meetings at the Library of Congress in these working groups to sort of thrash through what is best practice. Very soon, through Mike Frisch's intervention, we got rid of the notion of best practices because there is no, and came up with a different notion of decision trees. And the decision trees would be based upon what your objectives were and what your budget was and what your capabilities were. And it actually makes a whole lot more sense. A community oral history project is going to have very different decision trees and best practices than a university-based archival project. They're very different than a documentary project. So I was part of the, one of the group leaders of the collection group. And what we came up with was this, the Oral History in the Digital Age website, which contains these short articles and best practices, advisories, and other things. And the one quote that, because there were some media theorists present, and the one who had the most impact on me was Doug Ord. And he had this wonderful line: we need to begin our discussions from the question of how we use what we collect to use dissemination to structure discussions about collection. And so here, thinking about the history of oral history, this was what oral history really, the model from the 1920s to the 1990s. And this is what we sort of concluded together. It was basically an archival practice. It was based in the archives. And what you did was you used your analog tape recording of spoken words, and strictly spoken, to fill in holes in the historical record. Your technological bar was intelligible sound. As long as a transcriptionist could make out the words, you're golden, because nobody cares about the audio. You're going to reuse that. Nobody's using the audio. Maybe a handful of radio documentary producers. So the very best is complete edited transcripts with legal releases and audio tapes preserved. And this is basically then goes into the archive. And what your archival document then is a highly stable printed transcript of spoken words housed in a single archive that has tightly controlled access and use, right? You have to physically go there, you have to get your user's card, you have to ask in person for what you want to see, they have to approve you, and then curation is your card catalog. If you're lucky, you've got a full transcript. You've got, and then publication or dissemination is typically going to be by a small community of academic scholars who are writing journal articles or books. So archive was at the center. But what happens when you move into oral history in the digital age? And here's what we came up with. It's a different model. It's being driven by dissemination, not by archiving. And when you've got new capture technologies, when you can capture digital audio, video, and still images, or capture spoken words, verbalizations and performances, and digital object collection, because once we've got portable scanners, what I tell them all, whenever I do workshops or teach classes, I say an essential piece of field recording equipment is your portable scanner with your laptop. Because now you can basically scan the family photographs. You can scan the letters, you can scan the diplomas, and you never have to take them away from the people. All you need to do is have them sign the release form and fill out the metadata forms. And of course, when you think in terms of dissemination, when dissemination is going to be on the web, the spoken word, if your oral history collection is only spoken word, it's not going to be used in the future, unless it's Miles Davis or a president or someone who's very prominent and is going to get. But if you have all of that supporting documentation in other media, where people can listen, they can watch, they can see, they can interact, then your project is going to have legs, you're going to have audiences. So this was the new model. Okay, so what are we going to do then? 2016, 100th anniversary of the beginning of the Great Migration. 2014, I've got a sabbatical. Westchester, that's one semester off. And I'd written my dissertation on black migration to Philadelphia, that was back 1989. So that was still a long time ago. But I figured there's a real opportunity here because there's going to be an audience. 100th anniversary of the beginning of this extraordinary national, nation-transforming event. So what are we going to do? Great Migration Project was the idea. So first thing I think in terms of the history, back in 1910, 5.5% of Philadelphia's population was African American. By 1910, 44%, more than 44% of all Philadelphians are African American. And that's a story repeated in Chicago, in New York, in Pittsburgh, and industrial metropolises across the nation, including Los Angeles, right, with Watts and other sections. So there was clearly, there was a reason to do this, and the anniversary would be the hook. So who are going to be the partners? First person I approached was Louis Messiah, who directs the Scribe Video Center in Philadelphia. Louis set up Scribe as a community education center for African Americans. And he basically is objective. He directed 2 episodes from Eyes on the Prize, this famous documentary series on the civil rights movement for PBS, MacArthur Genius Award winner, an old friend. We know each other from, I've been teaching workshops at Scribe since the early 90s. So if I'm going to do a project on African American history, I've got to have African American partners. And Louis was excited about the project. Then on the other end, I needed somebody who had the skills, the digital skills, and fortunately at Westchester, I was able to convince the history department to change its hiring policies. So instead of getting the Eastern European historian, that moved way down. Instead of getting the American Civil War historian, that moved up. And I pushed up a digital historian to the top because I said, this is the future of history. We need to get a digital historian, and the sooner we get one, the more students we're going to get, the better. And so we got Janniken Smucker. And so Janniken was now in her 5th year at Westchester. Okay, she's settled in, she's ready to go. So I spoke to Yana and said, let's get to work. You want to do a big project? She said, sure, let's do a big project. And then we needed another partner. So I called up Doug Boyd, who was head of the Oral History in the Digital Age project, who developed OMS, the Oral History Metadata Synchronizer, at the Louis B. Nunn Center. And I said, Doug, we're going to start this project. We're thinking of using OMS. And he said, oh, that's a good idea, sure. And he said, where are your interviews? And I said, they're in my basement. And he said, well, do you want to transfer them here? So I said, yeah, why not? I'm not going to make any, back in my mind, back in the 1980s, maybe I'll make some money on these when I get old. They'll be they'll be worth something. They're not worth anything, nothing. So I said, yeah, you can have them. So we worked with the Philadelphia History Museum because they didn't have them anymore anyway, right? The only ones existed were the masters, which were in my basement. And then Doug became our other institutional partner. Then Louis and I wrote here are the partners that we put together. Scribe Video Center, Westchester, Philadelphia History Museum, which gave up its rights, Louis B. Nunn Center. Philadelphia Tribune is the oldest African-American newspaper in the United States in continuous publication. And their archive goes back to 1912. Incredibly rich material. Superb documentation of African-American history in the city going back. African-American Museum in Philadelphia had incredibly rich collections, which were uncatalogued, of photographs, of pamphlets, of all sorts of stuff. And then the Historical Society of Philadelphia, Charles Blockson is an African-American bibliophile who donated all of his records and collections to Temple University. Mother Bethel, the Tribune, Tindley Temple. Charles Albert Tindley was the father of modern gospel music. One of his songs was reworked into the We Shall Overcome, the anthem of the Civil Rights Movement. We have Philadelphia chapter of Garvey's Universal Negro Improvement, and then these other black churches and organizations. So and we're going to place an African-American artist, some of whom are internationally famous. Louis is an old friend with Julie Dash, who was the director of Daughters of the Dust. So Julie said, sure, give me a couple of $1,000, I'll do a piece for you. So these are top flight African-American artists, multimedia artists in the United States. And then on our end, we're going to build our class. And at Westchester, Janniken and I had to be creative because basically we are state employees in a union shop. And so what we decided to do, she'll teach a class in the history department, I'll teach an honors college seminar, and we'll simply meet at the same time. We'll stick them all in the same room. University doesn't need to know about it. Right? And it's legal anyway. We're carrying our weight. They're two separate classes. The chairs, the head of honors college and the chair of the history department think that this is great. And so her section was, we literally had first year students, 18 years old, through social studies teachers in their mid-40s. And for the honors college, I've got students from 12 or 13 different majors. So they're not just history students, they're from every major imaginable. We've got computer science, psychology, English, literature, a broad range. So they're different ages, they're different experiences. So Janniken and I focused on our end. And the first thing we've decided was that we're going to take all of the interviews and we're going to index them in OMS, which is called the Oral History Metadata Synchronizer. Doug had developed this thing But he really never had anybody who was taking full advantages of ohms. So what you can do in ohms is, I'll show you in a minute. You can basically, you can take the audio and load it in, or if it's video, the video, and then you've got these little frames where you can put in a segment title, and when you click on that, it opens up, and you can put in a brief segment synopsis. And the part that people hadn't used, what you can also curate. You can embed a hyperlink with a GPS coordinate to show you where this place, what they're talking about, and you can also hyperlink to an image. So here we're thinking we can curate these interviews with each segment, and you can, I said, absolutely, we're going to do, it's called level 3 ohms indexing. So if we're going to do this, level 3 is the way we're going. So we got to design the course. So first thing, I had money from a grant from the university. Doug contributed money, and we got unproofed transcripts for the interviews that we were going to provide to the students. And I wanted them unproofed because we wanted the students to do really close listening so that they would complete exact verbatim transcripts of the interviews. Every single false start word. Because what Doug had convinced us was that once we move into the digital, in the analog age, when the transcript was a printed document, you wanted to clean it up. You wanted to make it readable. But in the digital age, the transcript is simply another form of metadata. So it should be absolutely verbatim, an accurate representation of exactly what you hear. And this is what we were going to have the students do then. We didn't want the transcriber to clean them up. That was going to be part of the students' close listening. Then we established partnerships and agreements with regional archives to get the images. Because what we were going to do is load them onto an online archive that we built on our website. We wanted to identify digital storytelling projects and platforms. So here's the ones that Yannicka and I identified. Each of these are built on a platform that is shareware. So you can simply download it and use it. And they're easy to use because the students are going to build these things. We're not going to have anything to do with them once we get to that. But we want to show them different models of what you can actually do with digital storytelling once you have your interviews and your supporting materials. Then we had to design the course. So here are the 18 interviews that we started with. And you see anywhere from 45 minutes to over 2 hours. And for the 2016 class, we had another set of 24 interviews. Here are some of the archives that we coordinated with. Library Company of Philadelphia, founded by Benjamin Franklin, the oldest lending library in North America, which has an extraordinary photo collection. Mother Bethel Church had objects. This is stationary. Should Negroes come north? This was this was a flyer that they sent north, and here's the stationery from their information bureau welcoming members of AME congregations in South Carolina and Georgia and the Carolinas to come up to Philadelphia, because you come up here, come directly here, we'll find you a place to live, we'll find you a job, we'll provide you, direct you to the social service agencies that'll help you. So we've got all these and here articles from the Tribune, all these wonderful materials that nobody knows exist, that we can now use to tell this story for the 100th anniversary. And then, here's our syllabus, right? And the syllabus is online. So if you're actually interested in how it's structured, you can actually go in and look at it. What I want to do is, here's our workflow. We didn't know how this was going to work. Remember, we've got students who are from the age of 17 or 18 to their mid-40s, all different majors, and we're packing all of this into 14 weeks. So the first week was going to be, first 4 weeks was their exact verbatim transcripts. They've got to listen to the audio in ohms. They've got to correct the transcript, so it's exact verbatim, and then load that into ohms, and then they've got to create their indexes. And I'll show you what an ohms index looks like in a couple of minutes. They have to simultaneously create a thesaurus of keywords. So when I'm listening through, if I hear Mother Bethel, well, that's going to be a keyword that goes into our thesaurus. If I hear, some will be words that are in the interviews, an address, a black bank. Some will be terms, chain migration, employment, steel industry, Armstrong, whatever, and then they created literally hundreds of these, and then Yannickin and I had to go through them and sort of get a controlled vocabulary, so that when they start to auto-search, in fact, the term will come up, and they're all using the same words. So they're creating a thesaurus. Non-Center is going to create the Library of Congress subject headings because that's too technical. They also then have to find and permission images and enter them into an online archive that we're building. I've already got tons for them, but none of them are in the archive. So the ones that I'm giving to them, they've got to create the metadata. Then they're going to be finding their own stuff through Google, through Philadelphia history, through online websites. And then they're going to use those to curate their own indexes and build their own indexes. And then from weeks 3 through 7, we've given them all of these digital tools. And we're not going to teach them. They've got to teach each other. So we're dividing them into groups of 2 and 3. Who knows anything about GarageBand? I've used, okay, you're in the GarageBand. What do we call them? Boot camp. You're going to lead the garage camp boot. Who's worked with Photoshop? Okay, you 3 are doing Photoshop. And then when students have questions about Photoshop, they're going to go to the workshop leaders, not to us. And then we've got the more sophisticated ones, Weebly, whatever the platforms, the ones that we showed that they might be able to use for their own digital storytelling projects. And simultaneously, we divide up the Great Migration history. I'll give a brief introduction, but they're also going to, because they have to have mastered enough of that history to be able to do their storytelling projects. There's no point me telling them. They've got to learn it themselves. So we provide them core readings, and then they lead those discussions. So that's week 3 through 7. Starting in week 4, when their OHM's indexes are in good shape, what we decide was that you may have these wonderful indexes and with a full transcript, but why would anybody want to spend all that time if they don't know who this person is? So what we tell them is go through your interview, pull a half dozen direct quotes that you just love, that are just amazing stories. And then you're going to storyboard a biographical sketch. You don't need to be an historical expert. What your words will do is simply link readers from one incredibly powerful actuality to the next one. That's writing that they can do. They write the transitions. And then you're going to curate these biographical sketches with all of the images and newspaper articles that you're finding. And then if I read this biographical sketch and I really want to find out more about this person, then I'll go to the OHM's index and the transcript, and there's a reason for me to do it. That gets us through week 7, halfway through the semester. Then we've got break. Then when they come back, we divide them into groups of 3, and we say the rest of the semester, you're going to do digital storytelling projects. The OHM's indexes, the biographical sketches are going through multiple drafts. They're iterative. They're working on them throughout it. But the digital storytelling projects are all theirs. And they say, what are the instructions? And I said, here are your instructions. Be creative and amaze us. Those were their instructions. And they did. They amazed us. They did some amazing things. And of course, in order to do this, they've got to continue to find objects and documents, load them into the archive. They've got to edit their audio and video clips. They've got to clean up their images. And all of this, we were able to, so what did we actually produce? So here's Going North. Yannickin built this in Omeka. Omeka was designed for museum collections online by the Roy Rosenzweig Center for History and New Media at George Mason University. It's software, it's free, it's easy to use. You simply go in, you choose a theme, very simple HTML coding. You can change the size of the font, you can change the color of the font. You can figure out whether you're going to stick your image on the right, stick your image in the left, stick it on the bottom. It's sort of very simple cut and paste and build. It took students a couple of hours to learn how to build their exhibits in Omeka. And then Yannickin built the larger website. So what we did, while he's looking, you see, what we had, 998 keywords that Yannickin and I then had to sort of drop this one, that one is the same as that, sort of coordinate these. An archive of, what was it, 554 objects from more than 20 archives and repositories. So let's start with the oral histories. So these are our oral histories, and fortunately from the original radio series, I hired an African-American photographer who took really good portrait shots. And I had 3 or 4 of these, but in the African-American Museum, when I'm going through files that no one's looked at in 30 years, I found 8 of the portrait photographs from my project from 1984 that I didn't even know even existed. And we were able to add these in. So let's go to Beulah Collins. I love Beulah. So here is, and if you click on the left on transcript, here is the transcript for Beulah's interview. And you can go in anywhere in here. If you click on one, the audio will come up right there.
My father used to tend, worked on the farm, and they raised horses and cattle.
But how are you going to know what's there? So now scroll back to the index. Here is the index on the segment titles. So if we go into, let's say on domestic service, low wages. So here's the beginning of the first words that you'll hear in that segment. Here's the segment synopsis. Here are the keywords. Here are your subject headings. And if you click on the audio, now you'll be able to hear detail.
My land, there were none.
And drag down a little bit. Let's see if we've got any
there,
curation here.
Mrs. Rickett
So yeah,
gave
click on
me
this.
$13.
Newspaper article from the Philadelphia Tribune from the 1920s talking about the low wages of African American women and live in domestic service. That's the curation that brings this stuff to life, right? So you can start, if you want to find out what's in there, well then you've got each one of these segment titles and then it'll scroll through. And then now if we go back up to the website. So now let's go to biographies. So who is Beulah Collins? Here's an abstract that the students write. And then here's what the biographical sketch looks like, just for Beulah. There's her photo portrait from 1984. In gray are the direct quotations that the student chose. Here is their text to write to and from them. More remarkable story, she is a young woman who grows up on the farm in the eastern shore of Maryland, so it's below the Mason-Dixon line. Her husband is inducted into the Army in the First World War. He dies during the influenza epidemic of 1918. She's pregnant. She goes to Philadelphia, both for work and for the health of her infant, and she basically goes there so her kid will be able to get an education. So when I interview her in her 90s in the senior center in West Philadelphia, she's never been back home since the First World War, but she's kept her grave. She's got a grave next to her husband. When she dies, she's going to be buried next to him. She lived, scroll down, so she lived in this house, and if you click on that, this is in our archive. The student went to Lincoln Drive in Philadelphia because we had the address. This is the house that she was a live-in domestic in. So her boy boarded with Mrs. Roberts and other black kids whose mothers were in live-in domestic service. So we have the photograph, right, of the house that she in fact lived in when her son went on to become a high school principal in Philadelphia. But it's just this amazing story, and the student, she was a sophomore in honors major, came up with the title, The Quiet Courage of Beulah Collins, and it's just a wonderful story. And so if you get gripped by Beulah, then you'll go into the interview, to the Ohms Index and the audio and the transcript to find out more about her. Embedded into the Scribe Great Migration website was a Google map, which is something that the Pew wanted, in which we put points for the churches and the different things. And I went to Louis and I said, why don't we build a walking tour for African American history? Philadelphia has a huge tourism industry, and it's people coming from all over the world to see Independence Hall and the Liberty Bell and the Constitution Center. And I've been involved with the Greater Philadelphia Marketing Corporation and the mayor's office for 2 decades now. And how do we get people involved move to neighborhoods in Philadelphia? In the early 2000s, we created a trolley car tour of the civil rights movement in Philadelphia. And what we're coming up with is the 250th anniversary of the founding of Mother Bethel, which was going to be drawing 30 to 40,000 African-American ministers and their families to Philadelphia from all over the country. We said, why don't we create a walking tour of Black Philadelphia during the Roaring '20s? And Yannick and I built this with 3 students. So this is Story Maps, which is a free online platform that you can grab right off the web. So we start them at Mother Bethel. And what we wanted was then and now photographs. So here's the map, right? Here's Mother Bethel, the heart of the African American corridor. We walk them up South Street, which is the famous street in Philadelphia. Where do all the hippies meet? South Street, right? Which was the heart of the old Black corridor. This is the first great African American civil rights. We couldn't find it then, but there's Dickerson. So that's his offices, what it looks like today. There's Dickerson. And if you draw that back up again, we had one student then who, you click on here, here's J.B. Summers, who was worked with Dickerson. So we start with a period recording.
Well, there was a Negro attorney here, G. Edward Dickerson, very influential attorney, and Dick called me in for advice in his campaign. This thing was so tight between Pepper and Bear, you know. They offered G. Edward Dickerson $10,000 to withdraw.
So here he's talking about a bribe that was offered to him by the Republican city machine, so they pull out of an election that the white Republicans thought he might win, and Dickerson refused to pull out. But so if you just scroll through these, so here's Broad and South Street, which was, this is like 125th Street in Harlem. This is Philadelphia's equivalent on 8. Click on 8. That's what it looked like then. Here's what it looks like now, the exact same spot. And here you've got, this time it's 2 narrators who talk about, you know, when you came to Philadelphia the first time and you wanted to meet somebody, you'd go to Broad and South. And we've got the music, and then again, the audio excerpt. And you sort of make your way all the way up, and then it takes you out to African-American built housing and the largest undertaker in the city. And if you go all the way up to the last one, Broad Street Station. So here's the Broad Street Station in the 1920s. It burnt down in the 40s. And here's what it looks like directly across from Philadelphia City Hall today. And if you click on the audio on this, this is Crosby Brittenham, who would go up to the Broad Street Station during his time off as a barber, and he'd simply look at people as they arrived from the south at the station. And he describes them coming up in their overalls and sitting on their suitcases eating chicken. So this one is this is a long one, 2 minutes and 13 seconds. Period recordings, the voice, the then and now. It took us a month to put together, and it's just, you know, for me it was just first time I'd done a digital-based walking tour, just to see what the capabilities are. But again, this is all evolving technology and all getting better. So we've gotten a lot of good press from this. We won a bunch of awards, and the students, we brought them to Oral History Association. A number of students from this course have gone on to graduate school. They've been getting hired as OHMS programmers. They've been skirted up to in internships and professional opportunities, because once they leave this class, they've got marketable skills. A historical society, a museum, if they've got, you know, kids coming out of our class with these range of skills, they're leaping over students from much more prestigious universities and much more expensive universities. And what I love is that I'm an old guy. I can't, you know, my creative genes are sort of, most of them are behind me. But what I love with students is that since this is the first generation that is digitally born, this is mother's milk to them. They have great creativity and facility when you unleash them with some digital tools, particularly when you give them content that's so rich. And what we found is that when they have to do that close listening to do the OHMS indexes, they come to identify intensely with their narrator and feel very protective of them. And that's the amazing part, that they do identify with that one person so intently that they want to really do well by them and present them in a light that's going to be as respectful and as engaging as possible. So the courses have been a tremendous success on many levels. So there's a long-winded explanation of what we've been doing. Any questions?